Okay, and in the meantime, somebody popped up a chat. Henry needs no introduction. Thank you, Kate. That's very nice of you to say. You lie charmingly. All right, hi, welcome. This is the archival storage talk. We're going to be talking about the OU and Regional Research Store, known as OURRstore. My name's Henry Neeman. I'm from the University of Oklahoma. I'm the director of the OU Supercomputing Center for Education and Research, and I have a variety of other titles as well. I want to thank especially Dana Brunson. I want to thank a bunch of other people, and because I'm blanking at the moment on all their names through the excitement of doing this talk, then they should all consider themselves suitably thanked. My gratitude is high. Let's dive right in. Assuming I can get my stupid thing to do its thing. There we go. Okay. This is actually the single slide that I was asked to make about the grant that we got for this. This is an NSF Major Research Instrumentation grant we got for this project. Excuse me, it was for just under $1 million. I always say it that way instead of saying the actual dollar amount, because just under $1 million sounds a lot better than 968,000. And the idea is to build a large-scale, long-term, multi-copy, multi-institution storage archive to hold very large bulk data sets for a very long period of time. This is actually our second go-round on having a large-scale, long-term research archive. Our current system, which is at the end of its life now, called the Oklahoma PetaStore, was designed for 12 research groups at the University of Oklahoma and currently serves, I can't remember, it's over 50 research groups now. I have the number somewhere in the slides. And that little picture you see to the right, I'll have a little bit of story to go with that, but that picture came from the reviewers not believing in our project the first couple of times we submitted the proposal. Will the slides be available later? Yes, if you did not get the slides from any of the following mailing lists that I sent them to, the Campus Champions mailing list, the Virtual Residency mailing list, or the CARC People Network mailing list, if you're not on any of those mailing lists, and so you don't have the slides, send an email to me personally, HNEEMAN@ou.edu. Send me an email, and I will cheerfully, thank you, Dana, and I will cheerfully send you the slides. But if you are on any of those 3 mailing lists, you should have gotten a copy of the slides just in about the last 15 minutes. And that's so if you are on the telephone, I know there's at least one person who's called in on the telephone. If you're on the telephone and not over the internet, you can still follow along with the slides from home. Okay, and I will try to remember to call the slide numbers out as we go, and I will forget, so you'll probably have to follow along based on context. OURRstore is going to serve hundreds of undergraduates, graduate students, staff, postdocs, and faculty from institutions across the United States in roughly half of the, please share the slides. Yeah, please send an email because I'm not going to remember to check the old chat. Please send me an email, hneeman@ou.edu. It's in the chat here, and I will cheerfully send you the slides. Okay. Hundreds of people from institutions across the country. The idea is to be able to build large and growing data collections. Our capacity will be measured in the, I'm going to guess, couple hundred petabytes range, where a petabyte is 1,000 terabytes or a million gigabytes or a quadrillion bytes. So hundreds of quadrillions of bytes of data. Not for any one person individually, knock wood, but for the group of you as a whole. To be able to share those data sets, publish them, make them discoverable and searchable. And this is available to researchers in EPSCoR states and territories. If you are in an EPSCoR state or territory, you probably know what that means. If you're not, then you may not. EPSCoR stands for the Established Program for the Stimulation of Competitive Research. For the first 30 years, it was the experimental program for the stimulation of competitive research because, like any good federal experiment, it took 30 years to figure out how to make it work right. But now it's the established program, and it's roughly speaking those states that get less than their, and I'm making my fingers into little scare quotes, less than their fair share of federal research funding. So they get kind of a boost. So we decided to target the whole of EPSCoR, also all of the states in the Great Plains Network, but only one of those states, Missouri, is not an EPSCoR state, so the overlap's pretty big. The issue is that STEM research, and in fact non-STEM research, is more and more data intensive. Research collections are growing incredibly rapidly. It's expected by, I think it's 2025 or thereabouts, the amount of, I think it's just genomics data, just bioinformatics data, will exceed all of YouTube. And that, to me, is probably the most astonishing way of thinking about this, that all human video from all over the world will be less than the amount of genomics data that we're collecting for research. Just one research discipline will have more data than all the video in the world. Colleges and universities, research institutions around the country and around the world are not prepared for this. The volume, velocity, and variety of data is unbelievable. The rate of acceleration is terrifying. And more we're moving to, and no one will say this out loud, but this is the reality. We'll never get to the following, but this is the direction we're headed, even if no one will officially say this is true. Every bit, everywhere, to everyone, on every kind of device, all the time, forever, for free. Now again, we'll never get there, but we will get closer and closer to that. And any business model that you build around research data is going to have to start from there and work its way backward to what's practical, not start from what's practical and try and get to there. If you start from what's practical, you'll never get anywhere close to that. But if you start from there and then back off to what you can actually achieve, you'll be headed in the right direction. That's where we're going. To do your experiments, now more and more, you not only need the new data, but you need data from previous experiments to do comparisons. This is more and more a thing in the biosciences. You've got to have all of that data, and the data is enormous. There is just no way to buy enough disk to hold it all. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. So the approach we're taking is to use the worst possible storage technology except everything else. And that worst possible storage technology is tape. And I've got a slide about how terrible tape is, so don't panic. I know how much you hate tape. I'm going to tell you why, even though you hate tape, and I know you do, you should still embrace tape. Okay, so this is going to create a national model for affordable, large-scale, long-term, resilient, multi-institutional, multi-copy storage. We have a lot of folks who are from underrepresented populations participating in this. We're going to be using this in a lot of education initiatives to show people how this stuff works. And we're working with research data librarians to help them understand how to better help researchers with their research. All right, so here's the outline. I'll give you a little history. And then we'll sort of break this down. Why is physical data management hard? How do researchers behave in their native habitat? What's a business model that can make this work? And then we'll go into the details of the technology. So a little bit of history. Back in 2015, we submitted a $5 million proposal to the NSF's Data Infrastructure Building Blocks program. Will the Zoom recording be available later for colleagues who aren't able to attend live? Yes. To buy a pair of these archives, we would put one at OU, University of Oklahoma, and one at University of Arkansas. And some of it would be mirrored between them, and some of it would be, there'd be some here and some there. And we got, I'm not sure if this was literally the worst reviews I've ever gotten in my life. I might once have gotten poor, poor, poor fare instead of poor, poor, fair, fair. But in the NSF's review rating system, there's excellent, very good, good, fair, and poor. So think of that as A, B, C, D, F. So poor is F and fair is D. So that's an F plus average on that 2015 proposal. Our reviewers on that 2015 proposal hated our proposal with a fiery hot passion. To a large extent, based on their comments, to a large extent because they thought it was a complete mismatch for the program we were submitting the proposal to. So the next year, we submitted a much smaller version for just one system. It was a smaller system at OU with a lot, it didn't have any money in it for people and so on and so forth. $800,000 to the NSF's Major Research Instrumentation Program. It got interesting reviews, but it was nowhere close to being fundable. So we got basically an A minus B plus, sorry, we got basically 2 Bs and 2 Ds. So that's a C average. They weren't going to fund that. The NSF prides itself, it only funds really good proposals. And their proof of that is that their success rate typically is about 25%. About 25% of proposals that are submitted actually get funded, often at less than they requested. So then in 2017, we resubmitted, took another shot at it, same program, same dollar amount, same outcome, but a better set of reviews. It was improved. So we got a B average instead of a C average or an F plus average. And then in 2018, we finally got it funded. We actually asked for a bit more money, and we got excellent reviews. We got 3 excellents and a very good. So that was call it an A minus average, and that finally got funded. Okay. So it was, we went terrible, terrible, so-so, fantastic. Okay, so physical data management, why is it challenging? All right, so think about a big data set. Let's say I've got tens of terabytes or hundreds of terabytes or petabytes or whatever of data. So why can't I just go to Walmart or Costco or Target or wherever and just buy myself a pile of USB disk drives and put my data there? Well, the answer is I could totally do that. By the way, several years ago, I was at a workshop sponsored by the National Science Foundation on research data management, the research data management life cycle. And at that workshop, oh yeah, don't forget the count of files. You might have not just millions of files, you might have billions of files. And at this workshop, there were VPs of research, there were CIOs, and they asked that exact question. Why can't we just buy a bunch of USB drives from Walmart? Oh, and Dana has posted the slides now on Google Drive if people want to download it from there. And so the VPRs and the CIOs were, well, especially the VPRs were asking, well, why can't I just go to Walmart and buy some disk drives? And the answer is you could totally do that in much the same way that you could go to a NASCAR race with your riding lawnmower and you could drive out onto the track on your riding lawnmower. Now, you're not going to win. You're probably going to get killed, but in theory, you can do that. Just because you can do something doesn't make it a good idea. I can pick up a brick and bang myself in the head with it, but that doesn't make it a good idea. So here's the thing. Why can't you do this? Why can't you do your own? Well, if you've got a small data set, let's say you've got a few tens of terabytes. Yeah, you could buy some USB drives at Walmart or Costco or whatever, and they're cheap, right? So you can buy an 8 terabyte USB drive off the Walmart.com. I mean, this is literally yesterday I looked at this. Off the Walmart website for 142 bucks. That's 20 bucks per usable terabyte, more or less. You have to buy, you have to buy twice as many of these drives. So you have dual copies in case the drive breaks. And, over time, what you're going to build up is a cardboard box filled with these USB drives. And that cardboard box filled with USB drives, maybe you get one of those dyno label makers, and so you put a little label on top of the drive that says sort of a general category of what's on that 8 or 16 terabyte disk drive. Yes, you can buy 16 terabyte drives now. But, if you're looking for a specific individual file from a specific individual experiment, oh, you're going to have to look at every single one of those disk drives to find that thing, or at least a good chunk of them. And, you know, after those drives have been sitting in that cardboard box for a few years, the thing that you're most afraid of, and the reason you don't ever want to go looking for those files, is because you're terrified that when you plug that disk drive into your USB port, the drive is going to start making that charming chunka 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 noise that means that your data is gone. You are terrified of that. In addition, you're also going to have the problem that if a colleague from another institution asks for some files, or even worse, a stranger from another institution asks for some of your files. Say they read a paper you published and they want a copy of that data. Oh, good luck finding it, right? Because they don't know what the file names are. They don't know what the experiment was. So unless you've kept extensive, elaborate records, and I guarantee you, you have not done that, unless you've kept extensive, elaborate records, there's no way you're going to find what they're looking for. On top of that, remember that unless you're buying these at $5,000 worth at a time, you are paying indirect costs on these, because under $5,000, even equipment is subject to indirect costs. Above $5,000, they call it permanent equipment, and you don't have to pay indirect costs on it. At most research-intensive universities, indirect costs is on the order of 50% of direct costs. So for every dollar, let's say if you spend $142 on a disk drive, then you're going to have to also give $71 to somebody at your institution for the overhead associated with that expenditure. So that 142 is no longer 142. It's what, 213 or something? It's significantly more, right? Okay, now as you get bigger, you're going to start to give up on the cardboard box full of USB drives, because that's no longer really practical for all the reasons that I've just rattled off. So now what you could do is you could build yourself a little RAID enclosure, a bunch of disk drives pretending to be a big disk drive. But the problem is that your price is going to start going up, so that the cheapest place that I'm familiar with, and I'm sure there are others, and I do not, as a state employee in the state of Oklahoma, I do not endorse or disparage any product, service, or firm. So I'm only giving this as an example because I'm familiar with their website. But you can buy a box with 60 drives of 16 terabytes apiece. That'll run you about $42,000 in sort of the cheapo version of that. That translates to about $51 per usable terabyte. By the way, that's an overly optimistic estimate for the cost per usable terabyte. It's actually going to be worse than that, because at that scale, you can't have just sort of a minimal amount of redundancy. You got to go whole hog. Plus, you really are going to need 2 copies of this thing, so that 51 becomes 102, right? And it starts to get weirder from there. So the cheapo version of this is already 2.5 times the price per usable terabyte of that box of USB disk drives from Walmart or Costco or wherever. And on top of that, you've got to have a lot more expertise to configure and manage this disk resource. And of course, your risk is always going up and so on, right? And by the way, in both the case of the USB drives from Walmart or Costco or wherever, and the RAID system, about every 5 years, you've got to buy a new one. I mean, okay, so in theory, you might be able to run it out 6 or 7 years, but much longer than that, you're going to regret it. You really want to start replacing it along about 5 years. So you're paying for it twice to have the dual copies, but then sort of twice because you need to replace it partway through the life of the data. Because how long do you need to keep the data? The answer is forever, right? So you're buying a new one every so often. Now you could go to enterprise class disk. It happens that I have a pretty good idea of how to construct a particular device's pricing, and I pulled this off the MSRP sheet that IBM makes available, and I came out with a box with this many 14 terabyte drives. IBM for this thing doesn't yet do the 16s. They haven't certified them yet or put them in the pricing sheet or whatever, but they do the 14s. You're getting to $146 per usable terabyte per copy. Again, that's under certain simplifying assumptions. I haven't included the cost of the servers that would be attached to this. I haven't included the cost of the switches because this is a fiber channel thing, and probably now you don't have fiber channel switches sitting all over the place anymore. Of course, you got to have dual copies, so you're going to double this. You're going to have to buy it again after 5 years. Although the number of drives will come down because the capacity per drive is going up. Of course, you got to have a data center to stick it in because you really don't want to put this in a closet in your office. And then your labor cost goes up, your expertise cost goes up. So the people doing the labor, you can't have those folks be grad students anymore. You need full-time IT professionals to do this sort of thing. You can see the cost is getting higher and higher. So if I really distill this down to its essence, disk is expensive. That's really the fundamental issue here. All right, so why don't we just go to commercial cloud, right? We can do Microsoft Azure, we could do Google Cloud, we could do Amazon. They all offer these archival options, and they seem pretty reasonable. Microsoft Azure Archive, which is the cheapest one I've found, at least among the major commercial cloud vendors, it's actually not 0.001, it's 0.00099. I don't know how they landed on that. But that translates over an 8-year period, that translates to about $57 per terabyte. That's under the simplifying assumption that the cost per terabyte per year goes down by a factor of 2 every 2 years. That actually hasn't been true for getting on to a decade now. Really, that cost is going down by a factor of 2 every 5 years. So I actually did it based on every 4 years because that was easier to calculate, but I came up with it's really $84 per terabyte used over that 8-year period. Okay, that's the best of the commercial cloud vendors for archival storage. You can see by the time you get to Amazon Glacier, that's 4 times as much. It's a huge amount of money. The good news is they all keep multiple copies, so you don't have to like double that to take into account the secondary copy. But it does run you into a problem, which is, what are you going to do when the grant that you're on has expired? Because the thing is, if you've got, so a typical grant is like 3 years, right? At the end of 3 years, if your data is living in the cloud, in month 37, the cloud vendor will be happy to delete that data for you if you stop paying for it. Now, in theory, you could wrap that cost of that data into your next grant proposal. But there's 2 problems with that. One is that next grant proposal might not get funded. Most research faculty go through fallow periods where they have little or no grant money to carry them through, and the money they do have, they have to spend on their students because their students are trying to graduate, and it wasn't their fault that they started grad school during the year that was halfway into your current grant, right? So you're desperately scrambling for money. You don't have money to pay for that, and if you put it in your new grant proposal, how are you going to justify paying for old data that's not relevant to the new research on the new money? So the data, you risk the data being lost. And that's doubly bad because certainly the NSF and the National Institutes of Health, and I think this is more and more happening with the other research funding agencies as well, they're saying you have to keep the data for some certain number of years or perhaps arbitrarily long after the end of the grant period. And you can't charge that to the grant because once the grant's over, there's no money to pay for that, right? And one of the federal research funding rules is you cannot prepay for a service that hasn't yet been delivered. So you can't pay for month 37 during the 36-month grant period because they haven't delivered the service in that 37th month. So you can't use the commercial cloud unless you have some mechanism to sustain it well beyond the life of the grant that's paying for the data. All right, well, if we think about 8 years as kind of the time horizon that we're worried about, with at least dual copies in each case, we can start to see how this is getting to be a problem. The OURRstore approach, you can have dual copies on OURRstore of a full petabyte of content for $23,600, yesterday's price, by the way, literally from the pricing off the website yesterday. If you do that with USB disk drives, you're looking at $60,000. That's about 2.5 times as much. Put it on Azure, that's $84,000. That's 3.5 times as much. By the time we get up to on-premise enterprise class disk, you're looking at almost $1 million for dual copies over an 8-year period. That's 38 times as much as doing tape on OURRstore for the same outcome. Better performance, but the same outcome. And I guarantee you, if you go to your research funding agency and say, well, we want to do enterprise class on-premise disk because that's the best possible way to do it, even though it costs 38 times as much as using OURRstore, I can pretty much guarantee you what their answer is going to be. It's going to be, ha, that's funny. Okay. Now, tape is interesting because the problem with tape is the fixed costs, not the per unit costs. The fixed costs are enormous. And I calculated this out yesterday based on what we're actually buying. And what we came up with is 72% of total cost is going to be fixed cost and 28% is per unit. And that's for 11,000 tape cartridge slots. And I just realized as we were talking about this, actually that's an exaggeration. It's worse than 72%. It's more than 72%. Less than 28% is tape cartridge slots. I left something out of the calculation, I'm realizing. So maybe 20% is fixed, is per unit costs. Almost all of it is fixed costs, right? You've got the base frame for the tape library. We've got a drive expansion frame to make room for more tape drives. We've got the tape drives themselves, the servers, the disk, the network switches, the software, and maintenance on all of that year by year. Okay, well, what about Moore's Law? Doesn't Moore's Law help? Well, no, and no in two directions. The first direction is Moore's Law says computing speed and capacity doubles every 24 months. The problem is the data sets are growing faster than that. If you are, for example, in the next generation sequencing business, and if you're in the cyber infrastructure business, some of your users are in the next generation sequencing business, the improvement in next generation sequencing is a factor of 10 every 16 months. It's unreal. I used to tell the bioinformatics folks, don't spend your money on storage, spend your money on freezers. It will be cheaper to resequence the same physical sample than it will be to buy the storage to hold the data from the first time you sequence it. I was telling them that, and then one of them pointed out that every time they run an experiment, they have to check it against all the previous experiments as well. This is not true for all such experiments, but there's a class of experiments where that's true. So those folks are screwed too. In fact, they're probably screwed the worst because their data increases in size so quickly. The other problem is that in the olden days, spinning disk, hard disk drive pricing improved very rapidly. Up through 2009, the price of a terabyte got cut in half every 14 months, which meant that it improved by over a factor of 100 every 8 years. So what the same capacity would have cost you in year 1, by the end of 8 years would cost 1% as much. That was great, that was amazing, and those days are over. Now from 2009 to 2013, that went from, instead of every 14 months you'd cut the price of a terabyte in half, to every 44 months, about not quite 4 years, which meant that over an 8-year period you only improved by a factor of 4.5 in price per terabyte. Now, and this is for the last 7 years, the improvement is every 5 years, every 58 months, which means that over an 8-year period, you're only improving by a factor of 3 in the cost per terabyte. Tape, on the other hand, is improving in price per terabyte by about every 30 months, which means your improvement over 8 years is much, much better than for disk. In addition, that didn't used to be true, right? In the olden days, disk improved faster than tape, but now tape improves faster than disk. And in addition, the areal density of data already on a 16 terabyte hard drive, spinning drive, is 100 times worse than the areal density on tape, which means that tape has 100 times more growth potential than disk. Okay, now what about SSD? SSD improves a lot faster than spinning disk, right? Yeah, it sure does. And in fact, in 2018, prices on SSD it got cut in half in a single year. Well, the problem is that was a one-time thing. Since then, prices have not been improving nearly as rapidly. And it's still super expensive to do SSD. a petabyte of SSD, and by the way, that single copy is going to cost you $1 million, right? These things are really, really, really hard to break through compared to the price of tape. All right, now let's talk about researchers and how they behave in their native habitat. What are the qualities, what are the properties of a researcher in the wild? They are territorial, they're very consumed with, they're super cheap about everything, they're very stingy. They have no strategy for data management. Why are they like this? Let's talk about territoriality. Researchers love to hug their toys, and there's a very simple reason for that. Their faith in the university's central administration is basically nil. They don't trust their central administration. They hate and fear their central administration. And in fairness, it's usually because of something that happened either to themselves or to a colleague that was legitimately a bad thing, and that left a bad taste either in their mouth or in the mouth of someone who was then in a good position to pour poison into their ear. So if Professor X had a bad experience, Professor X went and told Professors A, B, C, D, E, all the rest of the alphabet about that bad experience. They poured poison in their ears, and now all those other people think that that thing is horrible. Okay, affordability. Researchers will only pay for the cheapest thing, and the reason they'll only pay for the cheapest thing is because there's no reward for paying for good stuff. Okay? On top of that, they don't pay for the cheapest thing, they pay for the thing that appears to be the cheapest thing, because they may not have deep expertise on these technologies. They'll look at sort of the surface of the appearance of cheap versus expensive. Yeah, Dana, can you resend that Google Doc thing?
Yep, got it.
Appreciate it. So they'll go for what seems to be the cheapest thing, and not take into account all of the sort of hidden costs like space, power, and cooling, because if you have a lot of disk storage generates just as much heat and draws just as much power as compute, especially spinning disk, generates a ton of heat and pulls a ton of power. You can't stick it in a closet anymore. That's just not plausible. It requires a lot more labor, and typically the level of expertise that's needed is beyond what you would find a typical grad student or even postdoc would have. It requires maintenance, and the older the thing gets, the more the maintenance costs. But the thing is that researchers are not rewarded for having good IT. They are rewarded for graduating students, publishing papers, and bringing in grant money. That's it. And anything that is not that, any expense they have that is not graduating students, publishing papers, or bringing in grant money, they will implicitly be punished for spending money on those expenses, in the sense that if they'd spent the money instead on graduating students, publishing papers, and bringing in grant money, then they would get more reward. Okay. So what data management strategies do they have? Here's the classic data management strategy. Your grad student has a PC under their desk. That PC has a single hard drive, and on that hard drive is all of that grad student's data. There's no backup of it anywhere. There's only one copy of it anywhere in the world, and it's on that PC under that desk. Thank you, Mark, for sighing in disgust. And, you know, when they graduate, the advisor doesn't know what format the data is, where it is on that disk drive, how to read it. So essentially the data disappears. Even though it's physically on that hard drive, it's effectively gone once the grad student graduates. And yes, you can send a hate mail to the grad student after they graduate and say, hey, where's all that data that I paid you to generate? But they're under no obligation even to bother to answer. And if they do answer, they probably can't even log into that machine remotely. And so, you know, what are you going to do? Then, you know, maybe you've got that cardboard box full of USB drives. There's no guarantee they still work. You can't search the files except by plugging them in. the probability that anybody has kept a detailed inventory of what's on those drives is basically 0. Okay, so some people are really careful about that. I've probably met 1 or 2 of them out of the many thousands of researchers I've met over the years, but, you know, way less than 1%. And they're probably not backed up. Okay, so why is that? And I've mentioned some of this, the perception of the administration. This is a common problem. There's a mindset gap too. So, you know, most researchers, their experience with computing and storage is their handheld, so their phone, their tablet, or their PC, their laptop or desktop PC. And those are at much, much smaller scale. And how you use them is very different. But the problem is that if they have no experience with large scale, then they have no mental picture of what it takes to operate at large scale, right? If I want to install software on my phone, it's very simple. It's just 3 taps. Once to open the store, once to tap on the thing that I actually want to install, and once to agree that the people who develop the software can listen in on my phone calls, right? That's it. And then it updates itself regularly, automatically behind the scenes, and maybe I get a little notification that it updated, but that's it. It's all lovely, right? And that software is either free or it costs next to nothing. If I want to increase the amount of storage I have on my phone, well, if I've got a micro SD slot, and my phone happens to have one, I can go to the store, and for probably 2 figures, you know, probably $50, maybe if I want to go nuts, you know, $150, I buy a little micro SD card and I pop it into the slot. It's automatically detected and I'm good to go, right? That's not how storage works at large scale. At large scale, first of all, you have a 3 to 6 month process just to purchase the thing, right? You're meeting with vendors, you're doing a public request for proposals, maybe you have to go to your board of regents to get permission. It takes months. Trust me, I've been down this road very recently. It's completely different, right? So they don't have a picture of that in their heads. Cost, they think, you know, grad students are cheap. My grad students there anyway. I'm paying them anyway. I might as well get them to do this too. Of course, they're not thinking about, well, any time they're spending working on the IT is time they're not spending actually doing research. We can add the lack of training experience on the part of the grads. Yeah, because increasingly, and especially at large scale, doing this stuff takes an enormous amount of expertise that there's no way a grad student would have the time to learn all that stuff, right? And the incentives I already talked about. Okay. So how can we make this at least appear cheaper, if not actually be cheaper? The first thing to do is don't make the researchers pay the whole cost. And the way to do that is to split out between the per unit costs, which we mentioned are small, versus the fixed costs, which are large. And so that way nobody has to bear the whole burden of the thing. And so the cost to each participant becomes affordable. And then leverage that funding to get other funding. So here's the business model that we use. We started this on our current aging out archive called the Oklahoma Petastore. And now as we're deploying OURRstore, we're going to be continuing this business model. The idea is we get a grant that pays for the hardware, the software, and the initial warranties on all of that. The institution, which in our case means the chief information officer, pays for space, power, cooling, network, I left that off, labor, and maintenance after the initial warranties expire. And then the researchers, excuse me, just buy the tape cartridges. So if we compare that to a roll your own disk, then for researchers using OURRstore, tape is cheaper, it's more reliable, it's less labor because you can treat it as if it were a file system. It requires less expertise on the part of the researchers. We do a 1-hour training for new OURRstore users. The downside is it's slower and it's less convenient, and we'll talk about that. The bandwidth is actually pretty good. For any individual file, these days they're getting 300-ish megabytes per second, which compares favorably to an individual disk drive, right? If you've got a USB drive, you're probably getting 25 megabytes per second. So it's more than a factor of 10 faster. But on the latency, the time it takes to start reading the first bit. For spinning disks, latency is typically 1 to 10 milliseconds. For tape, it's a minute. All right, so the idea is, let's distribute our costs among a funding agency, the institution, and the research team. So Nick says, do you have a dollar estimate for the institutional contribution over 8 years? Yeah, actually a pretty good one, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the estimate of what the cost share is. I'm going to secretly not include the cost of like the building, because the building got built anyway. So there's really no incremental cost to putting it in the building, because the building is nowhere near full, the data center that we have. The labor cost works out to be something on the order of 1/8 of an FTE per year. Most of that, once we get the thing deployed, most of that cost will be associated with training users, not so much actual labor running the thing. It largely runs itself with occasional upgrades and being burped if it gets into a little bit of a bad situation. So the institutional costs on labor are not much, and then the annual maintenance cost typically is mid-5 figures. So multiply that up by 8 years, you're talking about mid-6 figures over that 8-year period. Do you have any trouble getting warranty covered on the grant? No, and the way that we solved that problem was we put a requirement in the request for proposals that they had to provide guaranteed annual maintenance pricing through year 8. So they could put whatever number of years into the initial extended warranty. Oklahoma has a rule that state agencies, including public universities, can only buy annual support annually. We can't buy multiple years of annual support, but we can buy a multi-year extended warranty in the equipment purchase. So we can have some number of years of initial warranty and then a guaranteed annual support rate on each of the components. And every one of the vendors that responded to the RFP guaranteed the annual support rate up to year 8. There were 1 or 2 who didn't put it in their initial bid spec, but then we followed up with them and got it in writing for all the way through year 8. So we're distributing the costs among the funding agency, who pays for hardware, software, initial warranties, the institution, space, power, cooling, network, labor, and warranties after the initial warranties expire, and then the researchers are just buying tape cartridges. This is an archive, it's not live storage, so it's write once, read seldom if ever. The acronym for that is WOURRST. It's an independent standalone system. It's not part of our compute system. It's completely separate from that. It's connected to the compute system, so you can literally do a CP command to copy stuff over to the archive, but it's not part of the cluster, and you can access it independently from the supercomputer. We spend the grant funds on slots, not tape cartridges, to get as many slots as we can, so that the users can buy the tape cartridges. This makes it very expandable. Is the grant-funded model scalable? Oklahoma has 1% of the US population. It would take 100 million to provide this to the entire US community. No, it would not take 100 million, because we are covering all EPSCoR jurisdictions. Now, that is not half the US population by any means. It's probably 20%. I'm taking a wild guess. But that means this is going to cost 5 million, not 100 million. Do you have problems with ICR being charged for warranty and other support, since some institutions consider that non-capital? I'm not sure what you mean by ICR. Is that indirect costs? No, because in fact, the opposite is true. I'm glad you brought that up. So under the Major Research Instrumentation Program, there's a requirement for PhD granting institutions like OU, 30% of the total project budget has to be cost share provided by the institution using non-federal funds. So essentially internal OU budget, in this case, internal OUIT budget. But one of the cost share rules that the federal government uses is, if the cost share item is subject to indirect costs, then even though you didn't pay the indirect costs in any meaningful sense, they're considered foregone indirect costs, your cost share is still credited with those indirect costs. So OU's indirect cost rate is 55%. So if my boss, and maintenance support is a service, not equipment. So if my boss pays annual maintenance, then for every dollar he puts in on annual maintenance, he gets credited $1.55 of cost share because he gets to count the cost share of foregoing the indirect costs. So we love having cost share being charged on the maintenance. Now, by the way, cost share is not charged on the initial warranty on the equipment. And the reason for that is the way that cost share is calculated, it's done on a purchase order basis. And so if the purchase order is equipment, then the university treats everything in that purchase order as equipment, and therefore doesn't charge indirect cost on any of it. Did that help, Charles? Thanks. Okay, I'll press on here because I know we're already running late. And I'll just go until we lose interest in me. So we buy as many slots as we can, but not much in the way of tape cartridges. We make the media slots, the tape cartridge slots, available first come, first serve. There's a slight lie in there. The way that we couched this in the proposal was we split it into 3 pieces. There's a piece for where to put the old data from the pedestor, and that's reserved, and that's not part of the first come, first serve. Then of whatever collection of slots are remaining, half of the remaining slots are reserved for OU because we're assuming all the costs other than the grant. Half of those slots are reserved for OU researchers on a first come, first serve basis within OU. And then the remaining slots are available first come, first serve to everybody in all the EPSCoR states and all the Great Plains Network states. Software cost has to be as low as possible. And we've managed to do that. Media longevity has to be maximized. You don't want to have to repurchase the media. We're using Globus for file transfers and file sharing. We can't use it anymore for file publishing. They had a DOI generation feature in Globus, but they decided to drop that feature and no longer support it. I think because there weren't enough people using it to justify continuing to spend money on the labor to maintain that part of the code. So instead what we're doing is each researcher works with their local research data librarian to use their local institutional repository and do the file publishing via their local institutional repository. And then a technology built into the tape format. The tape format is LTO, linear tape open. It is the most popular tape format for data. It represents about 90% of the data tape market, I think over 90%. And LTFS is something that's been available since LTO version 5. We're currently on LTO version 8. LTFS, so linear tape file system, puts a tiny little catalog of the files at the front of every tape cartridge, which means that you can actually buy a tape drive with a USB cable, and you can plug it into your laptop, pop the tape cartridge in, and the system will behave like a USB drive, but with 1 minute latency per file. It's probably not 1 minute, but long latency per file. And then what we can do, because these tape cartridges are self-describing, is we can ship back to the person who bought the tape cartridge. We ship them back half of the tape cartridges they bought with all the secondary copies. So even if OU were to burn to the ground, which for the record will not happen, but if OU were to burn to the ground, or if our data center did, again, won't happen, but if it did, you'd have to buy 1 tape drive for $3 grand. The software is free and you can still get it all your data. So you don't have any data loss associated with somebody dropping a neutron bomb on Norman, Oklahoma, which again, will not happen. Okay, so how did these grants work? This was the pedestor grant. That was back in 2010. Now we have the OURRstore grant. It's a 3-year grant for an archive of at least 8 years. We started at 87 research teams. I think we've lost 3 of them or something. But based on the experience we had with pedestor, where we started with 12 and we have 55 now, I think we're going to have some growth in the number of research teams on OURRstore. People will come out of the woodwork once the thing is a success and they don't have to do any work to achieve it. So who's eligible? If you are in a Great Plains network state, even if you are not at a GPN institution. If you're in one of those states, you are eligible. By the way, you have to be at a non-commercial education or research institution. You have to, and the data has to be research data. At an institution in any of the 28 EPSCoR jurisdictions, there's the list of them right there. If you're in a non-EPSCoR jurisdiction and you want to buy in, you or a consortium of you can get together and buy a tape cartridge expansion cabinet. Until we run out of floor space, we can support that. You've got to buy the cabinet, and you've got to pay all the years of maintenance on that cabinet. We actually only have room for 2 such cabinets, so if you want one, you better get in on the ground floor. You find that groups store less data on their active data store once they have inexpensive archive available. It varies by group. It depends how their budget is structured. So we have one of our biggest groups. They put everything on both the archive, the tape archive, and their own disk. We have another group where roughly half of their data is on disk, but all of their data is on tape. And we already have 16 teams that each need at least a petabyte, half of them at OU. On the PetaStore, there were only 12 teams total, and none of them needed a petabyte at that time. Okay, so how much did we propose we needed? We discovered that our users needed 134 petabytes over that 8-year period. If we were to buy tape cartridges today to cover that 134 petabytes, that would be about 17,500 tape cartridges, which we do not have room for, right? We have room for 11,000. We can grow in the floor space we have available, we can grow to about 16,000. However, LTO 8 and LTO 9 will play into this later on, so we will have room for all 134 petabytes in the 11,000 slots. So research data, there are constraints on type. Not exactly. What the constraint is, it can't be legally constrained. It can't be regulated data. So no HIPAA data, no FERPA data, no ITAR, EAR, controlled unclassified information, none of that. If it's under legal constraints, OURRstore does not provide that capability. But if it is open data, and here by open, I mean not legally constrained. I don't necessarily mean made available to the public. But if it's not legally constrained, then we can take it, and it doesn't matter what funding agency. Now, there is a related question. What about institutional constraints? That's on a user-by-user basis because it's their own institution, right? Whatever those constraints are, they have to follow their institution's constraints. Passive tape storage outside the library. No, we do not provide that. We do send you your secondary copies, but the primary copy lives inside the archive because we will not provide the labor of going to the vault where all of the primary copies are sitting on shelves and finding the shelf where your particular tape cartridge is and getting that tape cartridge and carrying it back to the archive and putting it in, importing it into the archive. And all. We're not going to do that. Nuh-uh. That is way too much labor. No. We will fill up the archive slots, but that's it. What's the user interface? We recommend Globus. You don't have to use Globus. If you want to use SFTP or SCP, you could use those. But Globus is probably your best bet. And Mark is recommending you meet with your research data librarian or your VPR office or what have you to get some particulars on that. But no infinite capacity based on us going and getting tape cartridges. Okay, if we did that 134 petabytes with other kinds of media, if we needed on-premise enterprise class spinning disk, that would cost $31 million. If we were doing commercial cloud, it'd be 11 million. USB drives would be 8 million, and good luck with that. That's not a cardboard box. That's a warehouse of USB drives. It's going to work out to be about $3 million in tape cartridges. Well, that's if we were to buy it today. My guess is in practice it'll be about half that over the 8-year period, maybe a third of that. I would assume Globus would help manage the latency issues of tape. No, it does not. Globus doesn't help with that. And this is purely file. There's no object here. All Globus will do will be helping transfer the files and helping people do stuff like file sharing. It will not do any managing of converting small files to large files. There was a project, a very successful project, between one of the tape library vendors, not the one we selected, and the Globus folks to create software that would do that. But the Globus folks cheerfully told us what it would cost for us to do a similar project for a different tape vendor. And our answer was, no, people can aggregate their files into zip files so that they don't have zillions of tiny files, which is what we're doing on PetaStore and works great, right? I think we've had a handful of people violate the no small files rule in a big way, and we worked with them to fix that problem. You can see there's lots of money that is supporting the relevant research and lots of people who are going to be using it. We expect over 1,000 users. Okay, now, the common lament is, yeah, but tape sucks. And that is absolutely true. Tape totally sucks. But the alternative to tape is not disk, not at large scale. At large scale, the alternative to tape is not disk, and you saw that in the dollar figure. At large scale, the alternative to tape is throwing the data away. And so, do tapes encrypt data? We have that feature available. We're not going to be using it that way. We would recommend, and the reason is we do not want to have to keep the key escrow for everybody so that when you inevitably forget the passphrase or whatever for accessing your encrypted data, that we have to solve that problem. No, we will help you encrypt the data yourself at home, and then you send us the encrypted version. But when inevitably you forget your encryption password, that'll be your problem at home, not our problem. And quite frankly, if it's just encrypted on tape, that doesn't really buy you anything. Plus, if it's encrypted on tape on our system, there's no guarantee that if you had to download it on your system, if you had to buy your own tape drive, because we burned it to the ground, again, which will not happen, there's no guarantee that your tape drive would know our keys, especially if we had already burned to the ground. So you'd have a tape cartridge that you spent good money on that was full of garbage. It's no good. Okay. And if you need to drop off, I'll continue for a little while. I know I'm at the end of my official time, but I'm willing to go a little farther if people want me to keep going. 8-year cloud cost for 134 seems to apply only to Deep Glacier. No, I think that was I thought that was the Azure cost. Glacier would be a lot worse than that. Because Glacier is 4 times as expensive as Azure, at least at the moment. I'm sure that will change, but nobody likes tape, but tape is like democracy and old age. It sucks except compared to the alternative. Okay. So how do we resolve this? Well, so we don't allow small files at all. The minimum file size we're willing to accept is 1 gigabyte. And so what you have to do if you have a collection of small files is you have to aggregate them into either a zip file or a gzipped tar file. So we also want you to do your own compression so that, and we do have auto compression on our disk system, or we will rather, on OURRstore, but we want you to do your own compression. We want you to gzip or bzip2 or whatever, or zip the files yourself so that when you get it back to your disk, it's still compressed. So how much read load do you have on the current system? I'm sure it is not literally true that we've never had a read request queue up and wait, but we've almost never had a read request queue up and wait. We currently have 4 LTO5 drives and 3 LTO6 drives, and our cartridges are roughly half LTO5, half LTO6. And we almost never, I'll say it that way, almost never does a read request end up waiting in the queue for other read requests to go first. We're starting with 6 LTO8 drives on OURRstore. So at least for a good long while, I do not expect that to be an issue. Sorry, let's see here. Are all cartridges in the system in a drive? No, not in a drive. We're only going to have 6 drives, so only 6 cartridges at a time can be in drives, but they'll all be in the tape cartridge cabinets of the tape library. The primary copies will be. Secondary copies will be exported. Okay. Are you using a robot? Yes, this is a robotic tape library, and we required that in the RFP. What hardware vendor are you using for tape library vendor? Right. So this is going to be an IBM TS4500. That's the latest large-scale robotic tape library system from IBM. And this is actually the follow-on to what we have on the Pedestor, which is the TS3500, also from IBM. Okay. Oh, more and more questions. I love questions. What about the upper bound on file size? Right. So the rule that we use is the minimum file size is a gigabyte. The maximum file size is 10% of the raw capacity of the cartridge. So for LTO7 type M, which is a 9 terabyte cartridge, the maximum file size is 900 gig. We'd probably let you get away with 1 terabyte, but 900 gig. The recommended is in the range of the amount that can be read in 1 minute to the amount that can be read in 10 minutes, give or take. So on LTO5, LTO6, which is running about 150 megabytes per second, that was 10 to 100 megabytes was the recommended size range. So LTO7 type M is roughly double that. So I would expect 20 to 200 gigabytes is the recommended file size for starters on OURRstore. As we get to larger capacity tape cartridges, that'll go up a bit. Is there a disk cache that fronts the tape drives? Yes, that's exactly correct. So everything going onto tape starts on disk. You copy it onto the disk, and then it auto copies to tape. And all that's left on the disk is a stub that points to where it is on tape. And then when you are retrieving a file, first it gets copied from tape to disk, and then you're copying it from the disk back to wherever you're copying it to. Yeah. And I was just sort of talking about that. And so the way you have to think about this, because we don't take very small files and we don't take very large files, you have to think hierarchically, right? A small amount of very fast disk, a medium amount of slow disk, and a large amount of tape. Okay. How do you protect your investment? As a faculty member, as a researcher, if you spend money on storage, you want to have it for as long as humanly possible. Well, our original plan was we would keep your old media in the new system. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. We actually have a new plan that's even better than that, that still does not require the owners of the data to spend more money. I'll talk about that in a minute, okay? So the old longevity strategy was, well, tape cartridges are good for 15 years. And our current system is, I think, in year 7 now, or year 8. So it really went into full production in the beginning of late 2011. So call it 2012. So 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. So we are in, wow, we're in year 9 of full production now. We just started year 9. You know, the tape cartridges still have plenty of life left in them. So we were just going to transition all those tape cartridges, there are about 3,300 of them, from the old system to the new system. And we would have LTO6 tape drives in the new system in addition to the LTO8 tape drives. Well, we calculated it out after we had the bid responses, so we could actually do this calculation. We calculated the cost of doing that, including the lost tape cartridge slots, versus buying new LTO7 type M tape cartridges and not keeping the old LTO5 and 6 tape cartridges and having to have LTO6 tape drives in the new archive. And it turned out that there was a mid-5-figure savings associated with throwing away the old tape cartridges and throwing away the old tape drives. Hooray! We love that. So what we're going to do is we're buying 824 tape cartridges. In fact, they were just delivered yesterday or 2 days ago. They were just delivered this week. 824 tape cartridges, which identically matches to within a few terabytes the capacity of our 3,300 LTO5 and 6 tape cartridges. And we're going to just copy everything onto LTO7 type M tape cartridges and then throw all the old stuff away. And that way we don't have to worry about any of this stuff. So that's the cheaper solution. We actually compared the pricing, and it's a huge win financially to throw the old stuff away and make room for the new stuff. Okay, so we keep the old data at no charge to the owners of the old data, because that's cheaper than keeping the old data at no charge to the owners of the old data, so to speak. Okay. So here's what's going to happen. Once we have OURRstore in production, then we'll set the PetaStore to read-only. And then for every tape cartridge, we'll figure out what all its files are. That's in the file catalog that the software maintains. And then we'll read all the files in the correct order off of that tape cartridge and copy them over to OURRstore. And then we're done with that tape cartridge. We never need to worry about it again. Okay? The theoretical time it will take to do that is 3 weeks. We, in practice, expect that to actually take several months. And then when we go to the next one in 2028 or so, our goal will be to do the same thing again. When you destroy the tape, how you have it destroyed? I think what we're going to do is we're going to ship it to a local company that does this for a living, among various other things. I won't say the name of the company, but the university's been working with them for a long time, and they will destroy the tape cartridges. My guess is that they'll run them over a big magnet or something. I don't know. Okay, and I know we're past our time, but I'll keep going for a bit. So what's the architecture of the system? The tape library. We have a base frame. We have a tape drive expansion frame. By the way, both the base frame and the drive expansion frame have lots of tape cartridge slots, but then there's also a ton of tape cartridge only expansion frames. So we have 28 tape drive slots total for initially 6 drives, and then we'll have more as we grow. And this gives us room that if we need to buy more tape drives, or if someone else wants to buy tape drives of their own, we've got plenty of slots. It turns out it's super cheap to make these additional slots available. And by the way, those 6 LTO8 tape drives, they have an aggregate speed of not quite 2 gigabytes per second. It takes only 5 servers to run this thing, 3 to run the disk, 2 to run the tape. That's it. That's the whole thing, is 5 servers. And then the disk system that we're buying is going to end up being something in excess of 600 terabytes usable, and we'll get 2 to 2.5 gigabytes per second of sustained bandwidth. And it doesn't want to be a lot faster than that, quite frankly, because if it were a lot faster than that, people would be tempted to use it for live I/O on their number crunching when they're doing runs. That's not what we want it for. We want it for archive purposes. The disk is the front end of the tape. We have a couple of fiber channel switches. We're going to be using some existing 10 gig switches. I think actually we're using some existing 40 gig, 100 gig switches as well. And then the software, we're using IBM Spectrum Archive. It used to be called LTFS Enterprise Edition for the tape. And we're using IBM Spectrum Scale, used to be called General Parallel File System, or GPFS, for the disk. And in fact, you can't run Spectrum Archive unless you're running GPFS. And then Globus as sort of the top layer. Can you provide an estimate of how many FTE are responsible for maintaining your Globus infrastructure? To date, a tiny fraction of an FTE. That'll go up a bit because we'll be using it for more things like file sharing, but mostly that'll be in the training. Do we have Globus shared endpoints on OURRstore? And if so, is there a cost for this, since this implies some admin time? If it's going to cost us a lot of labor, the answer is no. I'm willing to have the discussion with you in more detail, Jim, but we're not willing to put a huge amount of additional labor into this, particularly to serve the needs of an individual institution. If there are a bunch of institutions that want this, we'd be more willing to consider that. Essentially, we got to know that the investment we make in the labor would pay off in a reasonably big way. Okay. New features. So this is a fun one. It turned out, so we were expecting to be able to forward only about 100 terabytes of disk capacity. And there were a number of reasons for this, one being just that disk is expensive. Another was that we looked at what the disk software was likely to cost, and that could be through the roof as well. Particularly once we landed on a vendor, once we landed on IBM as the vendor we selected through a very detailed and elaborate selection process. Once we did that, then we knew we needed GPFS. And to buy new GPFS licenses these days, you have to pay for it on a per terabyte capacity basis. And per terabyte, it ain't cheap, even if you're getting the academic rate, which is much, much lower than the commercial rate. And so it was looking like it would be super duper expensive. But on the Pedistore, we had GPFS, and the GPFS we had on the Pedistore was licensed per socket on the small number of servers. On the Pedistore, it was 6 servers. On OURRstore, it'll be 5 servers. Licensed per socket instead of per terabyte. And we had such a small number of sockets of CPU chips that price per socket meant the aggregate price of the software was still quite cheap. Well, searching on the IBM website, we found a lovely little disclaimer that said, if you already have active GPFS licenses that are still under active maintenance, then you can buy additional GPFS per socket licenses. If you already have per socket licenses, you can buy more per socket licenses. But if you don't already have active per socket licenses, then you have to buy per terabyte. So suddenly we realized that the cost of the software was going to be a tiny fraction of what we had budgeted for, which opened up the ability to buy more drives because there was no limit to how much capacity we could have because we were paying a fixed cost for the 5 servers that we needed. Not everyone would have this advantage. We happened to have it because we were already in the business. Jeff, if you send me an email, I will track that down. Yes. So, and true to their word, they got us the pricing, and the pricing was very, very reasonable per socket. And so we actually bought a few more just client licenses. The per socket license is not limited to version number on GPFS. It's in general. Are you concerned about IBM changing those license policies in the future? Well, they already did. I'm concerned that they will say you can no longer buy more. Sure. I am not concerned that they will say you no longer can use GPFS unless you pay for the terabytes. No, that is not consistent with their past behavior. They have had past behaviors that have made our life difficult, but that's not one of them. They've never said to us, you can no longer use the thing you have. But because we are super careful, by the way, in the original RFP bid response, there was a different disk system that was proposed, and it was vastly more expensive. So we were able to make a huge decrease in the cost of disk by doing a separate invitation to bid for a separate disk system that we specified. And so we're getting much more capacity, modestly higher speed, and much better pricing because of being real careful about these issues. Now, because of that, what we can afford to do is we can leave much, much more content on disk until enough new stuff has been requested that we have to clear out space. So files that are popular, that are being requested repeatedly, are likely to remain on disk, and therefore the latency will go from a minute to a millisecond, or 10 milliseconds. So you can do the calculation yourself, but that's many orders of magnitude difference on the latency cost of downloading popular files. Now, what we're also planning to offer is you can pay for permanent disk space on the disk system. You have to buy it. You have to pay for the disk, for the maintenance on the disk, and so on. But if you buy the permanent disk space, then you can just leave a set of files on that disk space, and that's your disk space that you paid for, that you can leave files on for as long as you like. We're not offering that today, but that's in our plan. But for most people, they won't need that because if their files are popular, then they'll get it for free. And if their files are unpopular, they don't care. Okay, Globus, real quick. So Globus goes all the way back to the late 90s. The Globus file transfer service has been around for about a decade, maybe not quite a decade. It's an independent standalone software system now, uses a web interface. It's run by, they're not really a nonprofit, they're actually part of the University of Chicago, which is a public, not-for-profit university. The software for an institution of our flavor is typically about $20K per year for the institution as a whole. With OURRstore, we've structured it differently. We have a license that applies only to OURRstore. It's a permanent license on OURRstore. And then we have annual support, and we pay a significant amount of money up front in year one, once we get into full production, or at least into friendly user mode. And then after the first 4 years, which is what we'll pay for up front, then the CIO starting in year 5 will pay much less than the normal annual rate. But again, because it applies only to the one system, not to the institution as a whole. Globus provides file sharing capability. And so with a few clicks, you can say this file or this directory is now available to these Globus users or this Globus group or these other people or even the whole world, that anybody in the world can download a particular file or set of files. And you get the moral equivalent of a URL. So what this allows you to do is in your institutional repository at your own institution, instead of storing your bulk data sets in the institutional repository, all you store in the institutional repository is the metadata and then a pointer to the bulk data set on OURRstore. And of course, the incremental download cost to you or whoever you're sharing the files with is 0, right? File publishing, as I mentioned, is no longer a supported feature in Globus. So for the file publishing, you're going to be doing that through your local research data librarians, your local institutional repository. I mentioned about LTFS. The wonderful thing about LTFS is now if OU burns to the ground, again, we won't. But if the worst were to happen, you still have a copy of all your files that you can get at for a fixed cost. You buy one tape drive and a little, USB enclosure for it. The whole thing is about $3 grand. The software is free. You can get at your data. OU is covering the Globus license cost in this program. The grant is covering the purchase of the license, which covers the first several years. And then OU's CIO is covering the maintenance after that for OURRstore only. It does not apply to any other system. I heard rumors that one component of Globus became commercial or a lot more expensive. Doesn't matter because we have a commitment from the Globus people on the pricing. Now, if something goes wrong with our primary copy of your file and we need to get at the secondary copy that you have at your home institution on your tape cartridges, then you have to ship the cartridge to us and give us a prepaid shipping label to ship it back to you after we generate a new primary copy inside the tape library. So there's a little bit of risk there. An alternative is you can have 2 copies at OU and 1 copy shipped to you, in which case you've paid the shipping costs up front, so to speak, and you never have to worry because we can generate the new primary copy from the secondary copy that we have on site, and then you don't have to do any shipping. Research data management, when we wrote the DIBS proposal in 2015, we didn't talk about that at all, and the reviewers tore us, the first MRI, the reviewers tore us apart about that. But the problem with research data management is it's highly idiosyncratic, especially not just on a discipline basis, but on a sub-discipline basis. And there's no way we could develop expertise in all of that. So we punted. We said, we're not going to try and do that. Instead, we're going to work with your institution so that you at your institution can work on that. So what we're doing is creating a consortium of research data librarians at the participating institutions who will then work together to teach each other what they're learning about how to do this so they can help their local researchers. And that means Mark Laufersweiler, who's on the call, is going to be starting up conference calls once we're in production starting up conference calls among the participating research data librarians, and also recruiting new research data librarians at the institutions we don't yet have them at. Is the second secondary copy, in addition to the one shipped back to the user, kept in a robot slot or somewhere else on campus? Somewhere else on campus, in fact, at a different OU campus. So the OURRstore tape library will be on the Norman campus. The secondary copies will live in cabinets that are designed for that purpose in a data center, so environmentally controlled, on the OU Health Sciences Center campus. Okay. And by the way, this is just a subset of the institutions that we hope ultimately will use OURRstore. Okay, so the longevity approach we talked about, right? And so when we get to the successor to OURRstore, our goal is to do the same thing to transition from OURRstore to its successor as we're doing to transition from the Petastore to OURRstore. In addition, you know, disk is not going to last 8+ years. What we want to do instead is we buy disk up front, and then we're going to buy more disk partway through at the end of the grant period, but only partway through the life of the archive. And then we'll run that disk for 4 or 5 years. So the life of any individual disk system, servers, network switches, will be 4 to 5 years, but the life of the aggregate of those disk systems will be 8+ years. Okay, with respect to LTO, we get new versions of LTO about every 2.5 years on average. That's true both over the life of LTO. LTO1 was released in 2000. LTO8 was released at the end of 2017. Excuse me. So that's every I think it's like 2.4 years or something. But in addition to that, the last 2 versions were released over a 5-year period. So again, 2.5 years average. The LTO8 drives came out at the end of 2017, I think November of 2017. And we have 6 of those. The LTO8 drives can read and write LTO8 cartridges, LTO7 cartridges, and LTO7 Type M cartridges. So LTO7 Type M is literally an LTO7 cartridge, but with, we do a magic incantation that costs no money, and suddenly it has 50% more raw capacity. I'm not making this up. So an LTO7 cartridge has 6 terabytes of capacity. An LTO8 cartridge has 12 terabytes of capacity. An LTO7 Type M cartridge, which is literally just an LTO7 cartridge, but with a magic incantation, has 9 terabytes of raw capacity. And all that matters is the barcode you put on it, and the barcode costs the same whether it's a Type M barcode or a regular barcode. It's just a little label, right? And the way you format it the first time you format it. If you put an LTO Type M barcode label on the cartridge and you format it for LTO7 Type M, it is LTO7 Type M, and it has a capacity of 9 terabytes, even though you spent no money to give it 50% more capacity for free. LTO9 drives are supposed to come out this year. My guess is about the middle of this year. We're probably 3 to 6 months from the release of LTO9 tape drives and tape cartridges. But the pattern has been that the tape cartridges do not become break even per terabyte in cost until about a year after the release of the subsequent version of LTO. So LTO8 tape cartridges will not be break even, not to LTO7 Type M, but to LTO7 until after LTO9 tape drives are released, although they're getting pretty close, I gotta say. And way past that for LTO8 versus LTO7 Type M, LTO9 tape cartridges won't be competitive per terabyte until probably a year after LTO10 drives are released. Does Type 7M add capacity come from some form of compression? Heck if I know. I got nothing. There was a procedure for that for the audio tape storage for Commodore 64. Yeah, I had that with my TRS-80 as well back in 1970, mumble. So we originally budgeted to buy 4 LTO9 tape drives. But the thing is, turns out there's no point in buying LTO9 tape drives. And here's why. LTO9 tape drives would really only be useful for LTO8 tape cartridges. You can't even use LTO7 type M in an LTO9 or an LTO7 drive. LTO7 type M only works with LTO8 drives, period. Will not work with LTO9 drives. So an LTO9 drive would only be useful for LTO8 tape cartridges, and it's going to be a while before LTO8 is break even with LTO7 type M because of the free 50% capacity. So rather than worry about that, by the time LTO9 cartridges would be break even, would be after LTO10 drives were released. So forget about it. We're not going to even buy LTO9 tape drives. We're going to buy LTO10 tape drives. That's probably end of 2022, beginning of 2023. Worst case, at some point in 2023. This will require a couple of years of no-cost extensions on our grant. This is normal. I don't expect any difficulty with this. We expect to buy at least 4, maybe more, but at least 4 LTO10 tape drives. They'll be able to read and write LTO9 and to read LTO8, although that won't really be an issue. We won't care about that. But they'll be able to read and write LTO9 when we first get them, and we probably won't even start encouraging people to buy LTO9 cartridges until a year after we get the LTO10 drives. And then, when LTO10 becomes break even after LTO11 is released, then we'll still have the LTO10 tape drives to read and write the LTO10 cartridges that are finally worth buying. LTO12 drives will come probably after end of life or around end of life of OURRstore, and sometime after that, LTO11 cartridges will be break even on price. So it's unlikely that we'll ever have or even want to have LTO11 tape cartridges in OURRstore. So the fact that we won't have any money for LTO11 drives doesn't bother us. Okay, we're almost done, but if you gotta go, you gotta go, don't worry about it. A little bit of weirdness about LTO. So the way LTO works is typically LTO version N can, of course, read and write LTO version N. LTO version N tape drives can read and write LTO N version tape cartridges, but they can also read and write version N-1 cartridges, and they can read version N-2 cartridges. As it turns out, we don't care about the reading N-2 because the ratio of reads to writes is very low. We don't do much reading, we do a lot of writing. So LTO5 was 1.5 terabytes raw, about 140 megabytes per second per drive. That came out in early 2010. LTO6, 2.5 terabytes raw, 160, so just about the same, slightly faster speed. And that came out at the end of 2012, so less than 2 years later. LTO7 came out 3 years after that, 6 terabytes raw, but type M is 9 terabytes raw at no upcharge. You can only do type M in LTO8 drives, which is why we're starting with 6 LTO8 drives and no LTO7s or 6s or 5s. LTO8 will be 12 terabytes raw and slightly faster. Is 12 terabytes raw, and it's slightly faster than LTO7. Excuse me. LTO7 type M, by the way, even though it runs in an LTO8 drive, runs at LTO7 speed, 300 megabytes per second. So that came out at the end of 2017, which is 3 years after LTO7 came out. There was a lawsuit, actually, that kept LTO8 tape cartridges off the market for more than a year, I think closer to 2 years, but they're on the market now. You can buy them at lots of vendors. LTO9, the number I've seen, but I wouldn't rely on it, is about double the speed of LTO8 and double the capacity. That number I do count on. There's a published roadmap for capacities. I'm guessing mid-2020 is where we're headed. Could be late 2020, but it's probably mid-2020. LTO10, the number I've seen but don't believe is 1100 megabytes per second. And that'll be, again, double, 48 terabytes raw per cartridge. Probably coming out end of 22, beginning of 23. But, you know, we never know for sure. It doesn't look like 7 versus 7M involves compression. OK, great. I don't know much about that. LTO11, again, doubling the capacity. We have no idea what the speed will be. It's sort of increasingly speculative what the date will be. And LTO12, again, doubles the capacity. No idea of speed, speculation on the date. I think we've talked about LTO7 type M quite a bit already, so I don't think we need to worry too much about it. I think we've already said most of this, but the thing that we love about this, about LTO7 type M, 50% more capacity, raw capacity, for no upcharge, minor hand waving that is not meaningfully different in labor cost from what you would have done anyway. So the labor cost is essentially the same. And a 17%, a 1/6 reduction in read-write bandwidth. That's it. That's all you lose in exchange for 50% more capacity for the same cost. Okay. And there's another cost advantage that is sort of hidden, which is it takes 1/3 fewer tape cartridge slots. And since our limiting factor on tape cartridge slots is not so much budget, I think we'll have enough budget, it's the amount of floor space we have. We have room in that row for 16,000 slots roughly, and there's no way, we will not have budget nor another empty row to have a separate second tape library. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be filling up to that 16,000, and then we're done. So anything we can do to reduce the number of slots we spend per terabyte or per petabyte is already a win. Will there be another type M? I kind of doubt it. The reason type M happened apparently is because they changed the materials in the tape medium. They went from barium, BAFE, whatever that is, versus metal. I don't know what any of that means, but they changed the materials, and that's why they were able to do this type M business. So I'm not complaining. In theory, that could happen again. In practice, we should not count on it. Okay, and that's it. So I want to thank all the wonderful people who have contributed to all of this. Our co-PIs, Laura Bartley, Kendra Dresbach, Amy McGovern, Horst Severini, senior personnel Mark Laufersweiler, who's leading the research data management project for the research data librarians. Our advisory committees are enormous. Our advisory committee consists of over 100 people from probably 40 institutions around the country, maybe more. Our users, we already have, as I mentioned, 80-something groups set up. The OSCAR team, and particularly Patrick Calhoun, is our research storage manager. And then some former members of the team who participated in this. As you can see, we've gone through some transitions through the group. Our CIO, David Horton, and some of his predecessors, and our interim dean of libraries, Carl Grant, Mark's boss. And then, of course, this is funded by NSF grants. Here's some papers you can take a look at that cover some of these issues. And I love questions, so feel free to do questions either by voice or by the chat. So for someone who has been lost for most of this technical stuff, what do we need to do if we want to take advantage of this wonderful opportunity? So first you send me an email and say, Henry, I want to be an OURRstore user. I will then ask you some questions like, what institution are you at? Because if you are, for example, at a commercial firm, my answer is no. If you are outside of an EPSCoR jurisdiction, there are a lot more hoops for you to jump through, other than Missouri, which is also in the Great Plains Network. There are a few other questions. From there, we'll have you create an OSCAR account. We will not give you supercomputer access, just OURRstore access. You have to buy at least one, at least 2 tape cartridges. So right now that's about 120 bucks. And most of the vendors are giving free shipping even on single cartridge. And then you will have to buy, you will have to do a 1-hour training, and there'll be an OURRstore use agreement form that you'll have to fill out and sign and send to us. So your total labor cost, I'm going to say, is 1.5 hours. And your total capital cost is $120, plus indirect if it's being paid on a grant. You will have to pay indirect costs at your institution. You will not pay us any money. When you buy a cartridge, you're not buying it from us. You're buying it from a third-party reseller. And we got IBM to tell us in writing that y'all could buy from any third-party reseller you want. You do not have to buy. On the Petastore, we were told you had to buy from, they only gave us 2 choices, CDW and Staples, and we couldn't even find the cartridges on the Staples website, so it ended up being CDW. Here, we were told any vendor we want. We will give you specific brand and model number that you're allowed to buy, but you get to do the purchase, and we'll give you the shipping address, who to ship it to. So preferred vendor, it's preferred model and brand, but not preferred reseller. You can buy from any reseller. We can point you to several, but quite frankly, if you just go to Google or whatever your favorite search engine is, and you type IBM and we'll give you the model number, it's going to pop up a whole bunch of vendors that you can buy from. So we don't have a preferred reseller, just a preferred brand and model number. Okay, more questions. Is there a turnkey method to generate the institution local metadata that would enable searching file names and determining which zip they're contained in? No. And in fact, bear in mind that from the perspective of an OURRstore user, what they're presented with looks exactly like a regular old Unix file system, a regular old, if you're technical, a POSIX file system. You know, under the covers, it's much more complicated than that, but that's how it's presented to the user. If you're doing file sharing via Globus, then what you're giving to the people who want to download is the moral equivalent of a URL. It's not literally a URL, but it's basically a URL. In terms of creating things that are searchable, that's going to have to go probably through your institutional repository, unless there's a Globus feature that supports that. So, and Jonathan says, from Montana State says, we've been working on something related to that. So as solutions like that arise, we'll be happy to connect people to them. Any feature that's available in Globus, you will be welcome to use. We will not be creating software to support these capabilities. So if it's not in Globus, then we are not going to be in a position to help.
Sorry, I typed it. I think got lost in the barrage. When is it available for the early adopters? When is it available for the...
Well, we don't have an exact timeline because of the whole COVID-19 circumstance. So, for example, yesterday, for the first time since we went to work from home several weeks ago, I actually had to go to campus for literally 10 minutes to receive the package with the additional tape drives in it, because the person who normally would do the receiving at the data center is out sick this week. Hopefully not with COVID-19, but I don't actually know that. And my wife had gotten one of those masks, you know, so I actually wore that and like a leather jacket on a 75-degree day. And then I went home and immediately took a shower, you know, that kind of thing. We don't have a timeline on any of this. However, and part of it is we have to wait for OU facilities management to do a minor amount of straightforward electrical work that will only cost 4 figures. But there's a lot of haziness around when they'll be able to schedule that work. Even though the work is quite minor and won't take very long, the university is trying to minimize the number of people who are on campus. Now, IT functions, including IT functions supporting research, have been declared essential functions for the university. Nevertheless, the university is trying to minimize the amount of time that people are on campus. And so we are very carefully monitoring how we're doing that. And so today I do not have a timeline because the barriers are the electrical work and the physical deployment, which means bringing in at least one, probably multiple IBM people onto campus for several days. So all of that is sort of fraught with weirdness during our current unpleasantness. So I would like to say a few months, but I say that with the caveat that everything is higgledy-piggledy for at least a few months. Okay, I sent out some information about OURRstore to a somewhat widely distributed list at University of Alabama, Huntsville, and our on-campus library archives seem interested. Is this use case included in the intended purpose, or at least close enough? For research data, okay, so this gets a little weird. It can't be clinical research data, and of course, as I mentioned earlier, it cannot be regulated, legally constrained data like HIPAA data. isn't supposed to be non-research data, although we carefully, in the proposal, grandfathered in all the existing data on the PetaStore. So if there's like some education as opposed to research data on the PetaStore, it's grandfathered in. When we were doing the DIBS proposal back in 2015, I had a request about, well, could humanities data count for this? And so I sent the program officer that question, and he gave kind of a roundabout answer, but roughly speaking, his answer was humanities data is the problem of the National Endowment for the Humanities, with the implication not the problem of the National Science Foundation. So roughly speaking, if it is not legally constrained STEM research data, and it's from an EPSCoR jurisdiction or Missouri as a member of the Great Plains Network, then it is eligible. If it's all of that except it's from a non-EPSCoR jurisdiction other than Missouri, then it's only eligible if an expansion cabinet is purchased for that purpose. And if it fails any of the caveats that I listed, then it is not eligible. Do HIPAA restrictions still apply if files are encrypted at source? So I'm going to answer a question different from the question you've asked, because to the best of my understanding, encryption does not address HIPAA alignment. That is, it can be an important part of HIPAA alignment, but a resource like OURRstore is not considered HIPAA aligned just because it's encrypted. So if the data were to be de-identified, then it would no longer be subject to HIPAA. But if the data is non-de-identified and it is therefore subject to HIPAA, then the answer is a big, big no. What about data coming from a USDA project? As long as it is STEM research data that is not legally constrained, that is not legally regulated, then the answer is yes. We don't care who the funding agency is or even whether it is a funded project. Recovering data from OURRstore to recover a local repository failure, for example, could involve reading scores of terabytes of OURRstore files. Any restrictions on that? No, you can read as much as you like. If you're going to do big reads, we probably would ask you to contact us. And I think we'll have to incorporate that into the training. Because if you're going to be doing big reads, we would much prefer to optimize the read procedure so that, for example, you're marching from one end to the other of a tape cartridge instead of ejecting and reinserting, reloading that same tape cartridge over and over and over and over once for each file, which on, I believe, all or almost all of these tape library systems, if you don't carefully optimize the order in which the reads occur sort of by hand, and there are some tools for doing this, but if you don't intentionally manually optimize that, even with using these tools, then the default behavior is the cartridge keeps getting kicked out and brought back in and kicked out and brought back in, and there's tons of rewinding, and you basically wreck the tape cartridge, and the rate at which you get the data is very slow. So for very large retrievals, we would strongly prefer to work with you to make sure that those large retrievals are optimized. Is this true hierarchical storage? Meaning recently used data exists in the cache disk? Yes. So the answer to that question is yes. It is not, however, an HSM, a hierarchical storage manager in the traditional sense. That is, any file that you copy to the disk front end, the landing pad, will go to tape no matter what. And when the space is needed for other stuff that file is taking up on disk, then that file will be removed from disk automatically. But the system will not, well, so one of the things is, so for example, on our supercomputer, if you generate some data on the scratch disk, that data will not auto-migrate to the archive. You have to migrate it by hand. You have to type a command like cp to migrate the data, to copy the data over to the archive. Could one use GPFS data movers instead of Globus? to first order, no. And what I mean by that is the Globus layer is used to move data from somewhere outside of OU to OURRstore, or from OURRstore to outside of OU. Now, by the way, it could be inside OU as well, but I'm trying to paint the picture. It is not to move from a GPFS system within OU to the archive. The GPFS system that's part of the archive is just the landing pad for data going onto and coming off of tape. It is not a file system to be used as a file system. It's just a landing pad for getting data on and off of tape. So in theory, the answer is yes. In practice, the answer is no. A GPFS data mover would be useless because your GPFS disk system at your institution won't be connected to OURRstore ever. Have we run out of questions? I love questions. All right. So then if we've run out of questions, then thank you, everybody. I've had a wonderful time, and I'll use my standard joke. If you've had half as much fun as me, then I've had twice as much fun as you. And somebody asks, when will friendly user mode start? I refer you back to my answer about how long will it take to get this deployed. It is very hazy because of the COVID-19 situation. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks,
Thank
Andy.
you.
And Dana, you're gonna help me get the pointer to the YouTube version?
Yep.
It's ready?